So let's talk about the pinnacle of Imperial piety. Games Workshop have thrown a few challenges in the way of the Sisters of Battle, but how bad is it looking, and will the faction come back fighting? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Adepta Sororitas, with an overview of the Sisters of Battle and the radical new changes to Warhammer 40K's rules. I've been trying to get a video made on each one of Warhammer 40K's factions. We've already done a fair few, but time for a focused look at the nuns with guns. Previously in Warzone Nephilim, the Sisters really hadn't been doing so badly. They got some very nice points cuts in the previous Munitorum Field Handbook, and also got some very good secondary objectives from the Nephilim updates, leading them to do pretty well at tournaments, definitely towards the top end of the Warhammer 40k power scale, and a decent amount of big tournament wins. With all that in mind, let's talk through their Arks of Omen changes. We'll go through the balanced data slate, then the changes to the game more widely, then their points buffs and nerfs, secondary objectives, and a bit of an overall take. So first up, the Sisters of Battle didn't really change too much in the balanced data slate. They still kept that rather nice boost to the Miracle Dice, meaning that you get one both on your turn and the opponent's. But of course the big change for them was losing Armour of Contempt. Previously this was a rather nice durability buff across most of the army. It often meant that their units could be surprisingly durable even though they're toughness 3, as they were often saving on very good saves. It is going to make the army feel a lot more fragile and then more like glass cannons. I feel like it is a change that's going to affect things kind of unequally though. I feel like lots of the Sisters units care about it more or less. Celestian Sacrosants are perhaps a clear winner out of them. They never had Armour of Contempt because they already had their shields with the 4+ invuls and the 2+ saves. I feel like this is going to be a really big win for them. They'll perhaps be reclaiming their role as one of the toughest Sisters units if you do need a unit to hold the battle line and take some punishment. Otherwise, for Sisters units, I feel like Repentia don't really care too much, but they got a points nerf, as I think Games Workshop anticipated that. The Ministorum units didn't have Armour of Contempt in the first place, so I guess that means that this update is a relative win for them, perhaps particularly for Arco-Flagellants, with their mass AP-1 attacks being a bit more effective against units across the field. I'd say perhaps the single most affected units might well be the Paragon Warsuits and perhaps some of the vehicles. Paragon Warsuits definitely won't like this at all, as they were kind of bad in terms of durability before Armour of Contempt came along, and they're exactly the sort of unit that's going to be focused with very high AP weapons like melter things, and they're going to crumble to those a lot easier now. Unlike a few of the Sisters tanks, they didn't get any sort of points cut to compensate them. Otherwise though, I feel like it might not be the end of the world for certain units like Zephyrim, Seraphim, and Retributors perhaps. A lot of Sisters units tended to like just hiding in ruins and things and then jumping out and dealing damage before potentially being killed in return. They were an army that certainly liked to play a bit of a unit trading game, and I feel like occasionally that just might mean that a little bit less durability on those units isn't the end of the world, if they might well have been killed anyway. Finally, as a last consequence of the change, the Valorous Heart will go back to their prior rule set. That's the one that reduces AP-1 or AP-2 by 1 pip of AP, kind of like mini Armour of Contempt on the go there. I feel like this is still going to be a bit of a side grade of them in terms of relative power, still kind of handy as a slightly more tanky order, but that durability buff is going to be far more important against some armies than others. Some armies just have a lot of AP3 or AP0 attacks. Otherwise, for the Arks of Omen changes, quite a lot of other things have shifted around in the game. The Arks of Omen detachment itself is kind of handy to the Sisters of Battle. I feel like they're an army where competitive lists are probably going to take either few or literally 0 troops now. A lot of the most competitive lists were often just running 3 small units of 5-woman battle sisters, and that's kind of a soft sign that people would have been taking less of them if they could. In terms of the force organisation slots that you could choose for the Arks of Omen detachment, I feel like you could probably make arguments for building around elites, fast attack, or heavy support, to be honest. They've all got relatively strong sections, Repentia and Sacrosants in the elite slot, Zephyrim and Seraphim in the fast attack slot. They're both still really quite cheap, and of course there's the mighty Retributors and the Mortifiers in the heavy support slot. I feel like Mortifiers might be a bit more popular with the loss of Armour of Contempt and a points drop. Otherwise, for broad game-wide changes, free strategic reserves I think is broadly a win for the Sisters. Before Nephilim, where CP was super tight, I did see a few people using Repentia in strategic reserve, turning them up on the flanks and then using big miracle dice numbers to get them into combat. A pretty good way of delivering Sisters with some fairly bad saves. And of course, being in strategic reserve is quite a nice way just to get any multi-melters in range that you might need to, whether they're on Retributors, Paragon suits, or vehicles. For other options, you could take some allied armigers along potentially. I feel like they'd compete very decently with the Sisters' more long-range tanks, the Exorcist and the Castigator. Their firepower with the autocannons on the Helverin version I feel like a kind of comparable firepower, but the armigers get a better invul save and objective secured in counting as 5 models, very nice for holding down the home field. The faction has lost a supplement in the update. The Order of Armata Lady supplement has gone the way of the dodo now. Games Workshop's legal supplement list had this one expiring in January, where the Bloody Rose one is still around until June, perhaps even further cementing Bloody Rose being top dog. Finally, as well as Armour of Contempt going away for Sisters, it will be going away for the various flavours of Space Marine, and that does mean that AP-1 weapons are just a bit more take-all-comers. Could be helpful enough for fairly efficient heavy bolter platforms like Mortifiers, or potentially Arco-Flagellants with their million AP-1 attacks. Moving on, next up we have the points changes. Games Workshop weren't super heavy on these. It looks like there was just the one nerf to Repentia, and then 3 buffs to various vehicle units, I think to directly compensate them for losing Armour of Contempt. The Repentia went up to 16 points, I think that is to compensate them from the Armour of Contempt's loss, as otherwise they'd be probably one of the most played units in the whole codex, very strong before, and they don't really care about the nerf. As they are, I feel like they've probably lost perhaps a little bit of ground on the other units, but still they're a very threatening melee unit and can certainly punch up against a whole load of scary targets out there. I feel like maybe Zephyrim have perhaps just gained a little bit on them though. Otherwise, for the vehicle changes, the Exorcist went down to 120 points base, that's a 10 points drop, and it remains 150 points with the good missiles with the anti-tank busting ones. I'd say that buff is probably just about enough to compensate it for losing Armour of Contempt, probably still a little bit less durable as a unit overall, but a bit more efficient on the offense. I suspect though that even at this points cost, the Castigator probably still outcompetes it a little. The Castigator is 135 points base, and I feel like it's still probably the better of the 2 battle tanks. Mortifiers went down to 55 points, an 8% drop. A small but meaningful buff that, and I think it probably keeps them again about the same sort of threat, having lost Armour of Contempt, heavy bolters being a bit better with AP-1. I think as they go, Mortifiers really are efficient little units. No huge synergies going on or anything, but just some fairly decent anti-infantry heavy bolter fire, plus some good melee. And they're not even super easy to take out either, with 5 wounds and the feel no pain. I feel like we are going to see a few more of them now. Otherwise, the Immolator drops down to 90 points, which is kind of interesting as now it's just 10 points more than the Rhino with the heavy bolter loadout. Kind of seems that just for 10 points for 2 heavy bolters, that's pretty much auto-include over the Rhino if you are going to be only transporting a 5-sister squad. I guess if you need the extra transport capacity, the Rhino with its 10 slots is still pretty good, but I feel like that is getting to the point where if sisters are looking for a transport, then the Immolator is now going to be in strong contention when previously it just wasn't. With the multi-melters, that would now mean that it'd be 120 points for quad melter shots out of the tank, and again I think that loadout is pretty interesting, particularly as it can move at least reasonably fast to get that 24 inches in range of something important. Overall out of these, I'd rate Repentia is still very playable, the Exorcist is still a bit underwhelming, and Mortifiers and Immolators a lot more interesting relative to the rest of the list. I still wouldn't say they're so strong that they're massive auto-includes though. Lastly, for the big changes, we have the alterations to the Sisters' secondary objectives in these new Arks of Omen missions. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, the Defend the Shrine secondary was perhaps one of the most easy objectives in all of Warhammer 40k. All you have to do is nominate the easiest midfield objective and just make sure you take it towards the end of each turn, and each time you do, you score 3 victory points. On average, it was one of the highest scoring secondaries in all of Warhammer 40k, and it remains entirely unchanged, giving the Sisters access to a very easy secondary objective, provided they're not being wiped out hard enough to just deny them that entire area of the map. I still rate this as near enough auto-take in just about every mission, and you just have to go hard for that objective. If you're losing badly, the opponent can steal a few points off you at the end of the game, but overall it's still going to be a high score. The Leap of Faith one was changed quite a bit though. That was perhaps a slightly weird one before, where I saw a few players running around and doing pointless miracle dice actions just literally to score this objective, and Games Workshop seems to have decided that it wasn't working very well and altered it quite a bit. Now it looks like this one is basically one that you need to basically burn miracle dice to score yourself some victory points at the end of each battle round, and the higher the miracle dice that you burn, the more points that you score. It seems that if you burn a 1 to 3 dice, you score just the 1 victory point, 2 victory points for a 4 or a 5 dice, and 3 victory points for a fabled 6 dice, which certainly isn't going to be something that Sisters are really going to want to give up. It maxes out at 12 victory points, much as it did before. Overall, I think I would still rate this as a pretty strong objective overall. It just feels really quite safe in that if you invest some resources in it, you are absolutely guaranteed to score highly on it. But you're probably going to be sacrificing yourself a bit of killing and movement power in the process. I think my general aim for this one would probably be to burn dice of a 4 or 5 roll for the vast majority of the game, and then depending on how close victory points are looking like, maybe jump up to burn a 6 or 2, provided it's not going to be more value to use those 6s to key in some big damage or big charges against the enemy. It still seems powerful in a secondary objective that is basically impossible for your opponent to stop. It is kind of interesting just trading off a little bit of power of the Sister's best mechanic versus near automatic victory points. Finally, the one that's got a solid nerf is Sacred Grounds. This was also a very good secondary previously, and it's one where your infantry units or priest units do an action on objectives and sanctify them, the action completing at the end of the next command phase. You get 1 victory point for objectives in your own deployment zone, 4 victory points for any of the others, and it basically has been nerfed a bit on the scoring side of things, as previously if you completed it on the other objectives it will be 5 not 4. This one might vary a bit depending on exactly what map you're playing on. Some of the maps have some fairly easy objectives to access near your deployment zone, and for them it might still well be good. I feel like now it is going to be competing with banners pretty hard though, and I'm not convinced it's going to be stronger in the majority of matchups anymore. Definitely not unusable, but might just be a take or leave versus raising some banners. Finally, now all factions have gone down to 3 secondary objectives. The Slay the Heretic one for the Sisters of Battle is completely gone. I'd say out of any of them to go, it's probably the best one too. That was the one where you had to kill enemy units with Bolter Flamer and Melter Fire. All very fluffy, but the rewards on victory points just weren't good enough for doing so. Plus it was all a bit arbitrary as to which unit got the last shot. It was definitely the weakest of the Sisters' objectives by a very long way. Overall, out of these, they're certainly a little bit worse than they were before, but I feel like the secondary objectives are still going to remain a bit of a strength of the Sisters. Having one of the best ones in the whole game with the Defend the Shrine one is pretty lucky, and I'm kind of surprised that that remained quite so intact after Games Workshop looked at all the points. I feel like Leap of Faith will get used quite a bit, though trading off against the Miracle Dice will be painful, and then probably either Sacred Ground or Banners might be the next logical go-to, depending on the mission and the matchup. Obviously, if there's anything for killing, say, a whole bunch of vehicles or something, then all well and good. Overall, out of these changes, I would say that the Sororitas have certainly come off a fair bit worse. Kind of hard to argue that losing Armour of Contempt, one of their best units in Repentia getting a points bump, and their secondaries getting slightly nerfed, is going to be anything but bad news for the faction. I wouldn't say it's all terrible though. Being able to focus on more elite damage dealers is likely something that a lot of lists are going to take up. I guess there's going to be a few less regular battle sisters in the army, and I feel like at least some units might make use of free strategic reserve. In terms of changes to army construction going forward, I still feel like Bloody Rose is almost certainly going to be well on top. Repentia may have taken a small nerf, but still melee sisters are very powerful. And in terms of units that I think are going to be run a bit more than they were before, I feel like it's looking a bit more up for things like Sacrosancts, Mortifiers, Immolators, and maybe a Dog Martyr for objectives secured on a bunch of durable Sacrosancts. That feels like it could be a pretty reasonable trade-off for losing some troops and having a very tough unit that's also scary in combat. For the current good stuff, I think that things like Zephyrim, Seraphim, Retributors, Morvenval, and Repentia are all still very solid. They'll still be played in good numbers, and perhaps taken less before will be things like the Paragon Warsuits and the regular Battle Sisters troops units. Overall, I'd say that they will be a little bit less powerful than they were before, but it's certainly not the apocalyptic level nerfs that the Tyranids got, and the secondaries are still solid enough to compete against the rest of the field, particularly that Defend the Shrine one. It'll be interesting to see how Sisters lists develop after this though. Hopefully we'll get a chance to cover some tournament army lists at some stage. Let me know what you make of the changes though. Let me know what changes, if any, you might be making to your list to fit in with the Arks of Omen rules. Is there anything going to be seeing more time on or off the shelf? Finally, if you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics for more. I will be trying to cover the vast majority of Warhammer 40k factions in a video like this, and I'll leave a link to one of the other ones down in the video description if you want to check out the changes for Adeptus Mechanicus. Finally, if you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to help keep them coming, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.